This is Transported. From Rome to Austin, Part 2. Now, for some of you who are not in Podcastistan as I am, perhaps this is going to be a little esoteric. Maybe some of you have heard the Dave Smith and Douglas Murray appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast. Maybe none of these names really mean very much to you at all. So a little backgrounder that some of you might be able to skip. Joe Rogan is a former mixed martial arts fighter and occasional stand-up comedian, actually quite a funny one, who has become most famous for running what is now the world's most listened to podcast. He's had pretty much everybody on there that you'd care to think of, and he's really made his name because he has been willing to host people with very interesting and often controversial opinions, and to do so over a serious long-form structure. So, for example, he interviewed Donald Trump and J.D. Vance in the last election cycle, and he didn't interview Kamala Harris because she refused to come to his studio and record a proper full-length podcast. She tried to manipulate it, as it has been told at least, into a half an hour with prepped questions and on her terms and in her location, and he refused. Dave Smith is a comedian, or at least he used to be one. I've actually never seen him say anything funny. He claims to be of Jewish heritage. Apparently, he has some Holocaust surviving grandfather. I can't find any evidence that he was raised Jewish, did anything Jewish in his life, married Jewish, or has any Jewish identity other than that it has suddenly become politically convenient for him to mention his Jewishness quite frequently. And I suspect Douglas Murray needs rather less introduction to the kind of people who listen to my little podcast. Now, normally it's worth explaining that when you go on the Joe Rogan podcast, it's just you and Joe Rogan, and you have your 1, 2, or 3 hour long chat, and that's it. Now, Joe Rogan has tended in the last couple of years to host a much more predominantly anti-Israel and anti-Ukraine set of interviewees than one might expect, especially given that he is the guy who is supposed to ask interesting questions of all sides and do things in this great long form that really tries to get to the bottom of issues. His argument is, it's not that I'm taking sides, these are just the people I'm interested in speaking to. The more conventional speakers are already appearing on mainstream media. I think it would be fair to say that those of us who are pro-Israel do not feel that pro-Israel speakers get enough of the rub, and certainly not in the longer form that suits a pro-Israel argument better than simple holding up pictures of the dead Palestinian baby as a trump card to win any argument. Since October the 7th, Dave Smith has become a self-appointed expert, although he absolutely denies the idea that he is an expert and reverts to just being a comedian when too challenged, on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. His claim to fame is really that he's a libertarian and that he feels that America shouldn't be putting its thumb on the scale for one side or the other, and if it's going to do so, it should do so on the moral grounds that Israel is committing a genocide and we must think about the dead babies in the ruins, and he constantly uses emotional arguments about the poor 8-year-old girl who did nothing wrong, and any time that she dies, then we should all feel guilty of murder, and so on and so on. He appeared on another very well-followed podcast, Lex Friedman, whose interview style generally is simply to ask questions without a series of follow-ups and contentious demands for more information to back up the point. So in that style, Dave Smith gets to rant about all of these things at some length. I'm mentioning that because it is in this context that Douglas Murray is pulled into the Joe Rogan studio, where unusually he is being made to face Dave Smith in this kind of debate set up by Joe Rogan. But it's strange that Joe Rogan feels the need to do this in this way. It's really an unusual thing. And it has led many to question where Joe Rogan's loyalties to his idea that he is just a neutral party asking questions might actually really be. It seems apparent from the kind of guests that Rogan has on and the fact that Murray must now appear with a combative opponent that Rogan has maybe made his mind up on some of these issues. This comes especially in the light of Rogan hosting people like Ian Carroll and Daryl Cooper, who I may have mentioned briefly here before, but again, for those not in Podcastistan, Ian Carroll I will loosely describe as a conspiracy theorist and very likely anti-Semite, and he's interesting and speaks in a very erudite and fun way, and for those who'd like to catch on to all of the little dog whistles of blatant anti-Semitism, then he's particularly fun. Daryl Cooper is a little harder to pin down on exactly what his opinions are, but he also, whilst refuting the idea that he's really a historian, he just claims to be sort of amateur, terribly interested in history, but he is the one who has made his name by essentially claiming that Churchill was the real architect of the Second World War. He did it all by intent, and he was a terrible person, and in many ways the real villain. Of course, he then carefully says, oh, but I'm just saying this to get a rise out of people. If you listen to enough Daryl Cooper, it turns out that he's extensively read on one David Irving, who I hope doesn't need any introduction. But just in case he does, a refresher, he was a famous author, infamous perhaps, of a series of books that essentially denied or belittled the Holocaust. It's quite obvious that he's an anti-Semite, and when he sued the American commentator Deborah Lipstadt for openly calling him such, he lost a very complex libel case in the UK, where the onus was on her to prove that he knew full well that what he was peddling was a series of lies, and it was obvious what his motives were, and she trounced him in court, which is quite a challenging thing to do. It would be fair to say that at this point his work is discredited, and it's amazing that anyone has the audacity to actually try and quote it as serious work. Luckily, for the likes of Daryl Cooper, people like Joe Rogan are not terribly well read. And of course, the kind of people who listen to Daryl Cooper, and too many of the kind of people who listen to Joe Rogan, are again listening for the dog whistles that allow them to claim that it's the Jews behind pretty much everything. Dave Smith is a subtler case. Let's assume he really does have some kind of Jewish background. He seems to use that as a shield through which he can then make his various critiques of the way in which Israelis or the Jewish community, to his perception at least, are behaving. Now, in Podcastistan, this whole debate of Dave Smith and Douglas Murray has caused a lot of controversy, and that's partly because Douglas Murray's approach in this debate was not to go after all of the incredibly historically illiterate and utterly false comments that Dave Smith has made on various podcasts, and to instead try and address, really to Joe, the idea that if you run the world's most listened to podcast, you have some responsibility to ensure the quality of the interviewees that you have, and to do some research to hold them to account for their opinions, and to try and have alternate viewpoints, one after the other, not alternative viewpoints, you understand, so that you can try and give your audience a balance of views, and that should be done between credible parties. Or indeed, change the format and have an actual debate between them, I suppose. We all know that the reason why Podcastistan even exists is because the mainstream media and the broad left had spent all of COVID resorting to authority that turned out to be unwilling to have a proper debate between various parties of authority. And many people in Podcastistan, including people like Joe Rogan and Dave Smith, take credit for the fact that they called out a lot of the mistakes that were made during COVID very early on. For example, that lockdowns in the way that they were carried out were clearly going to go too far and didn't take into account the socioeconomic effect that would actually have a health consequence in the long term on society. I think that was reasonable criticism. Also, that we were told, let's call them exaggerations, about the efficiency, effectiveness and safety of the vaccines. I'm not somebody who believes that these vaccines were enormously unsafe, but I do think that we were sold a bit of a bill of goods. For example, we know now, and it turns out that they knew then, the governments and the companies that produced these vaccines, that the vaccines did not actually do anything to prevent transmission. What they did was they ensured that transmission would be less effective in terms of causing serious illness among many of the people taking said vaccine. We also now know that risk factors for many of the people who were essentially obliged to take the vaccine or risk finding certain freedoms in their lives reduced actually outweighed the potential benefits in certain groups. Again, I don't wish to exaggerate these claims because I think that's probably about the sum of the balance. That's the middle ground that I certainly would take myself. So this has led this group of podcasters to believe that that makes them the authority on everything, as far as I can tell. They seem to believe that because they called that out, it must be the case that they're being misled on everything else, and it's their duty to try and show us that nobody can be trusted, no authority can be trusted, including government. And that aligns with Dave Smith's personal politics, which is that he's a libertarian who believes essentially that there really shouldn't be much of a government at all. He claims, for example, to be a big fan of Ron Paul and a fan of the Mises caucus of the Libertarian Party, and so on and so on. And he rather claims, and I don't think that he's correct about this, that everybody in this anti-war libertarian camp would feel the same as he did about Ukraine, Russia, or Israel, Gaza. And that's not actually correct. Most of these people that he claims as his libertarian heroes don't have such absolutism. They don't believe in the concept of being anti-war per se. They believe in not getting involved in foreign wars that have no direct interest to America. It's a bit like saying, well, I'm anti-pollution. I mean, pollution is just a thing that's going to happen. Being anti-pollution doesn't mean that no pollution will happen again under your watch. It just means that we can do everything we can to reduce pollution, but sometimes there are trade-offs that have to be made, and some pollution will happen so that we can continue to exist. And war, in my view, is exactly the same. Yes, it should always be the last resort. Yes, it should always be limited. Yes, there should be moral and practical limits placed on the way in which war is conducted. And we have had an entire world order that has broadly tried to honour that kind of commitment. It's why, for example, the Geneva Convention exists. The problem is we live in an era where we are seeing the failure of that world order. That's why Russia can do what the hell it likes even as a signatory to the Geneva Convention, and it's why we are seeing the asymmetric and perfidious warfare of Hamas, which is so unbelievably effective precisely because the entire Western world has no real clue how to prosecute or even allow an ally to prosecute a war against the party that fights in that particular way. In fact, some are actively rubbing their hands with glee, much like Hamas are, because they understand that that asymmetry is causing Israel to suffer. It's suffering casualties and the drain of being in a war for 18 months, and it's suffering incredibly on a PR basis. Ironically, and hopefully this will save you some time in looking up what the Mises caucus is and who was von Mises. By the way, he was Jewish. The biggest and most famous fan of Mises is Javier Milei, who is extremely pro-Jewish and pro-Israel. So being in that part of the libertarian movement certainly doesn't mean that one has to be anti-Israel. Now, I happen to think that Murray got his tactics a little bit wrong in that setup. Firstly, it's a question as to why he accepted that setup at all when it was such a unique thing and obviously designed to be skewed against him in that way. I think he would have been much better instead of how he was made to look, which was that he was appealing to authority, which is something he has specifically pushed back against, that he himself has spoken about and recognized that the appeal to authority in Western society is exactly what has led to a lot of the disasters that he writes so eloquently about, not just in terms of the Israel conflict, but everything you see in, say, the strange death of Europe or the war on the West. I think a better admonition of Rogan would have been to come in much more combative and absolutely destroy Dave Smith on his arguments about Israel or about Russia, Ukraine. His arguments are so childish, and honestly, I came away feeling much stupider for having researched to do this little episode, having had to sit and listen to 5 or 6 hours of Dave Smith talking. The kind of facile argument that he makes, for example, is that the moment that the IDF blows up a building, knowing that there might be an 8-year-old girl who is going to be trapped in the ruins and suffocate to death because no one can get her out, makes all of us complicit in murder. It is such a simplistic argument. It's so easy to debunk, and it doesn't mean that we are heartless about that 8-year-old girl. It means that we understand that in war people get killed. War is not a war crime. And yes, one should do everything to try and avoid that 8-year-old being killed, up to a point. And that point is when there is a military target of such high value, and these are the rules of law, and this is what proportionality means, up to the point at which we have to conduct a strike because the value of the target is so high that unfortunately it outweighs that 8-year-old girl's right to life. It sucks. It really sucks, and we are living with the heavy moral consequences of those decisions, something that Dave Smith simply has no depth to be able to handle himself. That's one of the reasons why he hasn't visited, in my view. This is also one of the interesting things. Murray tried to appeal to the idea, and again, I'm not sure this was a great tactic, I think there was another way to go about this, that because Dave Smith has failed in 18 months to come here, or in 3 years to go to Ukraine, he should basically shut the hell up and stop holding himself out to be an expert. Now, of course, like I said, every time anyone tries to push him on that, he says, but I'm not an expert, I'm just a comedian. It's a bit like the way my dad likes to say it, everything before the but is bullshit. And to me, it's everything before the but I'm not an expert is bullshit. It's just a convenient way of being able to get away with whatever your opinions are. Now, I say this on my little podcast. I don't claim to be an expert on anything I tell you in these podcasts. I'm giving you my opinions. My opinions are based on the way I see the world. I am very happy to have those opinions shifted by somebody coming up with more persuasive arguments and giving me facts that I wasn't aware of. I am absolutely comfortable with the idea of saying, this is conjecture, these are my opinions. I'm very careful to do so. I would also say I have a damn sight more expertise on this conflict than Dave Bloody Smith. Now, Douglas Murray is quite a mensch, and perhaps as a non-Jew he feels he can't make this argument. But rather than say, how come you haven't visited Israel in these 18 months? I would be saying, as a Jew, you keep using the as a Jew comment to basically allow you to disparage and defame the Jewish people. As a Jew, who apparently is so proud of his identity, how come you've never even been here on birthright? You must have been offered a free trip. You're in your early 40s. You lived through peak birthright. So you must have been so uninvolved in the Jewish community that nobody even offered you a trip, or so disinterested in your Jewish heritage that you didn't take one. That, for me, is an argument that would be quite neat to make at this point. To give you some idea of the kind of falsehoods and half-truths and ways in which he clearly sees things through a really blinkered prism would be, for example, he says, well, I never apportion blame. I see these conflicts in this neutral way. But of course, as soon as he was asked what he thought of October the 7th and how it happened, he said Israel and Bibi are to blame. That was his view. He's always willing to look at context, but never to the extent that when Jews are persecuted and need to determine their own future to survive in their own state, at that point, no, he's out. His historical illiteracy is quite incredible. So he swallowed hook, line, and sinker, the Darrell Cooper, Churchill canard. He also has this incredible moral equivalence of any death. Living under any regime, however bad, is preferable to inflicting collateral death on innocents to get rid of said bad regime. So he has this general, I just don't want there to be any war thing, but at the same time he also admits that he doesn't actually believe in democracy. What I realized listening to this is a man who doesn't really believe in anything. He doesn't have any values that are actually worth defending. He disparages his own faith, and it's amazing to me that this is someone who purports to be on the right, but actually has a pile of the same self-hating, self-flagellating qualities that we have pointed out amongst the progressive wing of American politics. It's unclear to me that he believes in national movements or any self-determination, certainly not for Israel and Jews, certainly not for Ukraine. But when it comes to the Palestinians, he's very keen to point out that they should. To continue this level of stupidity that this man has. He thinks that the Zionists were the ones who invented Middle East terror. It's fairly easily debunkable. Therefore, everybody in Israel is a settler. He believes that there was a total blockade of Gaza that existed until October the 7th. Of course, no mention of how many trucks came through or the existence of an entire border with Egypt for both smuggling and bringing things through checkpoints. He believed that the Israelis were stopping the import of potatoes and sugar because they were considered to be dual use. This is just nonsense. He believes that Palestinians everywhere between the river and the sea have no rights at all. He doesn't seem to have heard of the Palestinian Authority or the fact that they are supposed to hold elections. Of course, he threw in the idea that it was a concentration camp in Gaza. He uses hyperbole, like saying that what's happened to the Gazans is like 1,000 9/11s. He thinks that Israel should negotiate with Hamas, and should have, in the same way as they negotiated with Egypt. Seems to not understand the difference between diplomatic discussions between two heads of state, and certainly doesn't understand the fact that the average Egyptian is also not particularly a fan of the peace treaty that they have. Totally missed the bit where there was an option in 1948 for the Palestinians and the rest of the world, including all the Arab countries, to create an Arab state. All of this is just missing from his rhetoric. I could go on and on. I've gone on for long enough. All of these are points, and the many, many more. I mean, I wrote down a list of the things that he said, either on the podcast with Rogan or the one with Lex Friedman, which came out before the Rogan one, that Murray could have just gone into bat and destroyed. among small things that also show that this is just a total as a Jew, he wanted to talk about the moments in pre-Israeli history where there were some people on the Israeli side who didn't cover themselves in glory. So apparently there was an organization called Lehi. Now, Lehi, as far as I'm concerned, is a valley in Pennsylvania. I think he meant the Lehi. If you're going to get it historically wrong, at least get the name right. He also had this fabulous conspiracy theory that I hadn't even heard before, that Chaim Weizmann was this peacenik who just wanted to live side by side with everybody, kumbaya, and that he was shoved out of the way by the warmonger Ben-Gurion. He also didn't seem to understand the difference between being a prime minister and a president. I mean, the guy is such a know-nothing that if I were Douglas Murray, I would have just savaged him on these points, just picked out 5 of them, blam, 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 shoot the guy down, prove that he is an idiot on this subject, an idiot. And that might have done a little bit better to show to Rogan, how dare you bring me on this program to debate this charlatan, and doesn't this make you question who else you've been listening to where there hasn't been a me here to rebut it? Unfortunately, that's not the tack that Murray took, and it has come back, I think, to bite him to a large extent. Now, the reason why I think this kind of thing matters is because we have seen the way in which the woke left destroyed itself partly by falling into this purity spiral, refusing to keep checking and doubting and asking questions of itself, and getting into a position where if you weren't sufficiently left enough, then you were out of the tribe, and forcing people to come along with them and keep their heads down until either they accidentally stepped over the line of whatever was considered pure and good on the left, or actively just realized that some kind of moral line had been crossed. So, of course, people like Bill Maher got pushed out quite early from that. He realized that this wasn't for him. People like Sam Harris took really until October the 7th to understand exactly if you lie down with dogs, you're going to get fleas, and so on. There is a danger that the same thing could happen on what's broadly called the right. And I think in many ways it's good, because I think we are flushing out who the hard right are from who the right are. And you can tell because the people who are on the moderate right are perfectly happy to have discussions with people who are on the moderate left. So the Free Press, by way of example, who I think is somewhere in the middle, hosted a really interesting debate between Sam Harris and Ben Shapiro about Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, in which was very respectful, and what it showed was that each side was essentially saying, yes, my candidate is flawed, but I think yours is more flawed, that's why I'm sticking to my side. But it was a very nuanced and sensible discussion, and I think we're gradually beginning to understand that the alternative media is splitting itself in much the same way as the mainstream media, into those that are genuinely interested in having a real discussion and those who wish to keep the purity of the party line. That actually the same tedious intersectional thinking that allows you to know from one person's opinion on one subject roughly what they're going to think about anything else actually applies to the right too, and that anyone who's like that probably isn't a particularly interesting person to have on a podcast, or to consider a particularly expert person, because simply towing those kind of party lines really does make one question one's objectivity. The thing that the hard left and the hard right have an amazing habit of doing, especially when it comes to Jewish stuff, is to just be asking questions. I'm just asking questions. Yes, but the mark of a charlatan is that even after somebody with some serious expertise and some real facts has shown you that they've given you a proper answer, you just move on to asking more questions. You never actually accept any of the answers that they've given you. They're not follow-up questions, they're skirting questions. That is the mark of a charlatan. So I think that people like Dave Smith are really, he says he's a libertarian, but I think he's a sort of anarchist and nihilist, really. And it's not a surprising thing to me that he is busy denigrating Israel or denigrating Churchill, because these are complex situations for Israel, as a complicated situation arose for Churchill, especially judging Churchill by current standards. It's very difficult to find leaders that we can get behind and say, oh, that's the right guy. I can agree with him on everything about the way that he acts, everything that he says, it's all great. We live in a world which is much more complex. For example, he slags off Netanyahu for saying, oh, he was always saying that Iran was 5 years away from getting a bomb. I mean, it's a really dumb comment, because say what you like about Netanyahu, Netanyahu has consistently said Iran was a threat and actually done something about it. Iran is 5 years away from getting a bomb just like it was 20 years ago, because we keep on killing their nuclear scientists and blowing up their nuclear centrifuges and pushing for proper sanctions that slow down their actions and making repercussions for them around the world. That's why they're 5 years away, you idiot, Dave Smith. I mean, this stuff is so simple, and it was a shame to me that Murray didn't take any of this on head on and just dismantle him and his credibility. Also, failing to hold some ideas in one's head at the same time. I can dislike a lot of Netanyahu's domestic agenda. I can dislike a lot of the way Netanyahu goes about things politically. I can dislike some of the ways in which Netanyahu says things. But I can also find what to like about Netanyahu in the way that he addresses Congress or in the way that he handles Iran. I think we don't have to be absolute on our positions. We can be an on balance yes or on balance no kind of people. One more little comment in this context about Dave Smith's sheer stupidity and inability to actually read any source material. He leans quite heavily on quoting General Wesley Clark, who discussed the Clean Break report, which is a policy document that was written up for Bibi when he was the Prime Minister in his first stint in the 1990s. And that Clark basically claimed that this was the basis of a neocon conspiracy, I think would be a reasonable word to use, in his language at least, to get rid of all of these various governments in the axis of evil and beyond. And he tries to claim that this was a joint effort of Likud and these neocons within the Republican Party. There's a slight flaw in that, which is that anybody can go and read this Clean Break document and they can see when it was written, by whom, and for whom. And what you find is that there was a study group that was brought together by Bibi under a guy called Richard Pearl, who, yes, was a neocon, and they were trying to look at a new way to deal with Israel's security problems. And the idea was to align Israel much closer to Western values and to try and see Israel's security as being better aligned to the US, specifically by reducing the reliance on the US for Israel's security, to try and position Israel as self-reliant, a country with whom the Americans would want strategic cooperation, to try and have a more Abraham Accords style approach of cherry-picking 3 or 4 countries. Now, at that time, they were talking about Turkey and Jordan. Now we know that Turkey and Jordan are not exactly the countries that we can rely on for these things, but a similar idea, which would then be used to push back on the more hostile countries within the Arab world. And also to do with understanding that Arafat probably was not the right guy to see through the peace accords and that other options would need to be in place. Now, of course, all of this has been manipulated into, Israel somehow paid for the research that the neocons then used to justify their war in Iraq and taking over Libya and so on. It's totally nonsensical to anybody who actually just goes back and reads the damn report. It's also interesting that Wesley Clark has had remarkably little to say ever since he was first quoted as mentioning this report, and that the only people who seem to constantly quote Wesley Clark on this are people who hate Israel, hate the neocons, like Glenn Greenwald, Al Jazeera, and so on. Oh, and Dave Smith. Anyway, the reason why I've dedicated a full half hour to trying to explain to you about this Rogan-Murray-Smith debate is because I actually think it matters. I think it matters that we have to discredit the kind of people who are clearly charlatans, who are undermining not just our right to self-defense as Israelis, they are undermining the safety of Jews because of the way that they speak. They are creating the conditions in which anti-Semitism leaches through the cracks of society and becomes justified. And whilst I don't expect Joe Rogan to gatekeep every single thing that somebody says on his podcast, I think he has to take, and this was Murray's point, some responsibility for the fact that his podcast, whether he likes it or not, is a gate. And at some point, he has to take responsibility for the fact that he has the keys to that gate. And that, fine, he wants to open the gate and he wants to see what comes out of it. That's great. But for the love of God, some people have got to be allowed to dam up some of the flood of what comes out. Otherwise, nobody can believe that he's really doing this in a fair-minded way. And if you cannot appeal to reason in the way that Murray so gentlemanly tried to do, then the thing to do is to show, by taking Dave Smith as the sacrificial lamb that Rogan put up for him, take him to the damn slaughter. I really admire the fact that Murray went into the lion's den in the first place, and also, to Joe's face, the most important podcaster in the world, said to him, "You're not taking proper responsibility for who appears. Yes, you can have who you like, but man up." If Douglas had been taking my tactic and applied it to the Lex Fridman podcast, he would have found that Smith is way off-piste, not just on the subject of Israel, but has all sorts of other things where he's clearly only partially understood the basic facts. So he believes, for example, that the US One China policy is actively about encouraging Taiwan to rejoin communist China, when, of course, the whole point of where they stood at the beginning of their One China policy was that nothing should happen to Taiwan against their will, but yes, they were very careful not to recognize a totally independent Taiwan. Unsurprisingly, Dave Smith also falls into the trap that most TikTokers did about Osama bin Laden's letter to America. He seems to have missed the bit where the original posting on TikTok was a very conveniently edited highlight reel and excluded all the bits where bin Laden went after everybody in the West who holds any, broadly speaking, non-Islamic opinion and promises just to slaughter them last after using them as agents of convenience to undermine the West. He also thinks that Putin's invasion of Ukraine basically was justified because NATO failed to promise not to allow the Ukrainian entry. And he thinks that Putin did so reluctantly. Even Lex, who normally doesn't push back on his guests, says it's quite clear that Putin pulled the trigger first and he's the bad guy, and that really ought to be a principle, which Smith seems to agree to, but then, of course, doesn't apply to Israel. He also quotes an absurd statistic of a 20-to-1 ratio of Palestinian to Israeli deaths over the wider Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which might just be true if you count all the Palestinians murdered by the Jordanians, the Syrians, the Lebanese, and so on. I think I've gone on enough about Dave Smith. Let me just try and kill him off with 2 more points. The first is this continuous shapeshift of, oh, I'm just a comedian, not an expert, and how this really reminds me of the Hamas asymmetry of being a non-state actor when it suits them. They can just say, oh no, can we just roll back to October the 6th? Oh, but we shouldn't be expected to allow people to hide in our tunnels. That's the UN's job. That's for the international community. This willful perfidy seems to extend to people like Smith. And I actually realized, having had to listen to so many hours of him drone on, that the thing that bothers me the most is that half of the time he's clearly memorized lines and trying to say them to appear natural in a debate. It's the way that a good comedian is supposed to sound, that they appear to be ad-libbing their entire script. But of course, it's like going to the theatre. There was a script, it's been written and practiced many, many times before and honed before an audience. It's just a shame that actually his delivery on Israel is a little bit faltering and hesitant at times, and you can see that he isn't really getting any deep grasp of the things that he's saying. He doesn't understand his own arguments. He's parroting lines that he's read or that somebody perhaps has prepped him with to sound really good to try and land heavy blows. I am unconvinced. So, why does Podcastistan matter? If you have a look at the total viewership or listenership of the top 10 or 20 podcasts on current affairs and news in the UK or the US in any given week, it basically dwarfs the cumulative viewership and listenership of all of the mainstream media, whether it's on the radio, on TV, or indeed their own podcasts. So it is the way that the world is going in terms of where people are getting a lot of their in-depth information and being able to explore in long form, which is the whole point of Podcastistan, the issues of the day. It's the equivalent, really, of why people used to read magazines like, say, The Economist or perhaps Time. It would give them that weekly injection of detailed information about a long arc story, and then they could keep up to date with things as they unfolded in real time from your conventional BBC or CNN. The sad part is that where this podcast community started was really around the idea that the nature of social media and the corruption of the mainstream media in terms of telling a sort of mainstream narrative and there being a sort of uniparty that nobody was really willing to challenge within the media and so on, of which some are stretches, but I think we can all agree that there is an element of truth to that. The idea of the podcast world was to be able to really have challenging and robust debate, to hear from different viewpoints, and to try and stop where we got to, which is that there was a split and you'd have an Overton window of the right and an Overton window of the left, and each thought that everybody outside their bubble was unacceptable. And the idea of Podcastistan was supposed to be to reshape the Overton window back to where it was supposed to be. What's happened in practice, though, unfortunately, I think, is that increasingly it is reflecting that same division that we see of the hard left and hard right, and of people who try to categorize themselves as being neither of the left or the right, but still they are at the edges of what you would have considered to be a window in the past. They're at the fringes of the big tent of ideas. And the problem that you have is somebody has got to delineate what is reasonable to discuss and at what point do you consider people to be bad faith actors. One of the reasons I keep picking on Dave Smith is because this is a guy who, at a time when people are losing faith in the Republicans and Democrats and wondering if there will ever be a serious third-party option, he was seriously considered by the Libertarian Party, of which he's a proud member, as their presidential candidate. So a guy who it's taken me 15 minutes to deconstruct and debunk on the particular issue of Israel that seems to have got his goat at the moment, this absolute ignoramus was somebody who was being considered as a serious challenger to the really pathetic status quo we have. The alternative cannot be Dave Smith, or anyone like a Dave Smith. See, that is the problem with the podcast era. There are no barriers to entry. I know this because I'm recording this on my phone with a £15 microphone, and it's not exactly difficult to set up a Spotify channel. Anyone can do this. And the challenge that Douglas Murray had when confronting Joe Rogan and Dave Smith was exactly that we don't want to go back to the authorities that have failed us and have turned out to be untrustworthy as well. But equally, we cannot have no authority. There has to be a middle ground. It's always the way that once you get into the Pareto curve and you start shaking down who listens to whom in, say, the podcast universe, and it turns out that 80% of the audience are listening to 20% of the podcast, or actually more like 95% of the audience are listening to 5% of the podcast, if that, then of course that accretion of power is going to end up having a corrosive effect. It goes to people's heads. They stop just asking questions in the genuine sense and are just asking questions to reinforce what they or their audience want. Of course they're thinking about audience capture and retention. I struggle to believe that even Joe Rogan isn't occasionally thinking about what his audience wants, despite the fact that he told Murray, no, I just have people on that I want to hear from. It is, of course, no coincidence that as this Podcastistan phenomenon has gained traction and it's been shown to be so successful, of course, mainstream media types, even if they are no longer working for mainstream media, have found their way to the format with startling success. So Gary Lineker, no friend of Israel's, and frankly, as far as I'm concerned, not a friend of the Jews, has set up a series of podcasts which all have the titles The Rest Is. So this is under his Goalhanger Productions, the most famous of which is The Rest Is Politics, with Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart. I could spend an entire episode, just like I have with Dave Smith, trying to take apart some of the absurdities of what those two have to say, especially Rory Stewart mouthing off about Israel. I mean, this is a guy who schlepped himself across Afghanistan and wrote a lovely book. And I always think that there's this whole custom in Afghanistan called Pashtunwali, where they give you great hospitality and try not to murder you if you're different to them. And I just think he is the ultimate Pashtunwali, because I think it has shaped his opinions as to who all Arabs and Muslims are in a totally Lawrence of Arabia wannabe kind of way. So we're seeing mainstream media now leaching into Podcastistan, and that could be why Podcastistan's original actors are now having to move themselves further and further to the fringes of the tent to try and maintain their audience and their space. Now, to bring this to a conclusion after 40 lengthy minutes, my apologies, we've been talking here about what has been coined as the fifth estate, the new media, versus, as I've just mentioned now, the fourth estate, the old media. And that's, of course, in the original sense of what the estate was. The first estate was the clergy. In part 3, we will have a closer look at what on earth is going on in the first estate, especially vis-à-vis the Catholic Church, and hopefully come to some conclusions about what the balance ought to be between those historical institutions and where we are in the modern world. You would have thought that the first, second and third estates, such as they existed and still exist now, would be inherently conservative. What we're finding is, of course, that they pander more and more to progressive attitudes in a bid to keep themselves relevant and, of course, to keep themselves in power. All of this still to come. Thank you as ever for listening.